I hope you're going well. It's good to be back at school, although I'm not there with you today. Again, apologies for this. Crazy start to the year. This happens every year, and then we're going to get a really good string on of lessons. So, firstly, I do apologise that I'm not there. If I was there, we would have been going hopefully into the sports hall or out onto the basketball courts or tennis courts and doing our hook into hockey um, task constraints based coaching session where I would have gone through a coaching based session with you as the hockey coach and made some different constraints based changes to that session. And so throughout that session, you would have been able to immerse yourself in that. We are still going to do that lab because the discussion questions that come after the lab are a part of your outcome task. However, obviously, with me being at the Year 8 basketball round robin today, I thought it was important we didn't have another broken lesson, and I thought if I can record something which got a little bit new information for you but also refreshing some of the information that you've already seen, I'll put this video together, let you watch it, and then leave you with some work to do throughout the remainder of this class. I will be back tomorrow. We will have a class because Year 9 sport runs at the same time as our lessons on the Tuesday and the Friday. It's nearly impossible for us to do a lab on the Friday class or Tuesday class. So I will be doing a theory lesson tomorrow with you, but I promise you that next Thursday we will have that extra lab session. We might even be able to squeeze in two, like we did with the blindfold frisbee golf and the blocked practice sessions. So, today's lesson, I want to revisit a little bit about the task and constraints-based coaching, and I keep saying task because I've just reread over it and that's something I want to harp on a little bit. Also direct coaching, but that'll come after because that was a big focus of our lesson earlier this week. So what I wanted to do was really bring the chapter back to its roots, its beginnings, and explain to you from start to finish what is this chapter 2 all about. Now that you've got some idea in your head that I've talked about analysis using numbers, which is that quantitative data, or descriptive terms, which is that qualitative data, and trying to use a blend of both when we provide feedback to athletes to try and get them to improve their skills, which is the whole idea of the chapter, improving skills. So we've spoken a little bit about that, but I mentioned that there was a 4-stage approach, and I said that I'm not going to go into that. Well, I will today during this PowerPoint. I'd like to thank Mr. Smith for his resource. I've decided that we will merge that resource with what his class have been doing so that there's no issues across both the classes. So I'm going to flip through that PowerPoint for you and talk through it momentarily. Then I'm going to show you an alternative PowerPoint to the screenshots that I gave of the textbook in class the other day. And then what I'm going to do as well is show you some further work. For those of you that have completed the Ed Rollo up to date, and I'll be doing an Ed Rollo check early Friday morning to see where people are at with their Ed Rollo work. So if you're up to date with your Ed Rollo, working through Chapter 1 and moving now into Chapter 2, that's great. If you're not, there's some time to get that done after this PowerPoint show. The other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is that peak book. I got an awesome question from one of our students the other day, which I'm going to send them an email in response to during this afternoon after I've filmed this. If anybody has any questions arising from that, please let me know. Okay, because us having this communication, even if it is online, is the best way for you to learn. So, without further ado, it's time for us to move on with this work. Here we go. Okay, so Chapter 2, Improving Skills. As we work through this, hopefully this gives you a refresher for some things and some new information for others. Now, we spoke yesterday about there being a link between developing motor skills and movement skills, but also participation and performance. And so there's a relationship in that the more that you are able to complete basic fundamental movement skills, FMS, the better off that you're going to be to set yourself up to be able to complete sport-specific skills and be involved in sport and exercise and physical activity later in life. So that relationship talks about enablers and barriers. The likelihood of you being able to enjoy and participate is based on whether you had enablers when you were younger and you were learning those fundamental movements, or barriers that stopped you from being able to do so. So just a reminder from year 11 what an enabler and a barrier is. An enabler is something that is a positive effect on someone's skills, and a barrier is something that has a negative effect on someone's skills. What do we mean by this? Well, if we had a really good coach or a really good teacher in primary school that taught us those locomotor skills, manipulative skills, stability skills, and you really understood what it was that they were teaching you, why they were teaching it to you, and got good practice and got a good grasp on that, then you would have developed that. They gave you time to practice it, gave you good feedback on practicing it. Now you would be somebody who is able to balance, manipulate objects, and be skilled in these aspects. So when a baseball coach comes to you and wants you to swing a baseball bat at an oncoming pitch, that is something that is accessible to you because of the enabler of having a good coach or teacher early on. So we talk about this about people building their confidence. So when people have a lot of barriers and therefore they didn't develop their motor skills, they will have less confidence in participating in sport and putting their skills on display to everyone else. The lack of engagement as young can also lead to them living a sedentary lifestyle. Remember that word sedentary, meaning without movement. So sitting on a couch, watching TV, lying in bed, they are sedentary activities. And people who are less active are living sedentary lifestyles, and quite often this comes from being less skilled in those fundamental movement skills. So as we move on through this presentation, we spoke about primary school teachers and being able to develop themselves, and having a really good primary teacher will help them participate later on. That is an enabler, and that is a link between the basic motor skill development and therefore participation and performance in later years. So here's a little example, a little activity for you. You can pause this video, go to the PowerPoint, highlight and copy and paste this in, or you can simply watch mine and just watch this one a couple of times. Let's just watch this dive. We'll watch it, I think it shows twice, once in slow motion, and then I'll leave it at that. And if you want, you can go and watch another one and find your own dive to watch. So we're watching that dive and we're thinking to ourselves, was that a good dive? Or was it a bad dive? And most of us would think that's not a great dive. Some people who have never seen the skill of diving before might not have anything to base that off. Is that a good dive? Is that a bad dive? I don't know. If that's the first dive I've ever seen in my life, maybe that was good. However, we all know, because we've seen dives and we've performed dives ourselves before, that that was not a well-performed dive. That skill is something that that student needs to work on. So we look at that and we think to ourselves, okay, how did I know that that wasn't a successfully performed dive? And what feedback could I give to that performer to improve their dive? So work through these questions here. Analyze the dive. How did you determine the success of that dive? What recommendations would you give to improve that dive? What data, if any, did you use to analyze that dive? What is the difference between quantitative and qualitative information and data? What might it look like if that dive was taught in a sports coaching setting? And what quantitative information could you give that person about their dive? You might not have the answers to that right now, but you might know what you would look for if you were going to provide quantitative information about a dive. What about watching that dive again? What qualitative, descriptive information could you give to that diver about their dive? This sort of activity is really going to help us moving forward, because what it's going to do is, again, expose us to more sports, more activities, more successes, more fails. We see the right thing, we see the wrong thing, we start getting into the habit of critiquing and articulating what is going wrong, which is exactly what they can ask us on an exam, is to look at a skill and talk about what sort of qualitative and quantitative information you would give as feedback to that athlete to improve their skill. So, moving on back into this presentation. You've seen these screenshots before. The one on the left I talked about in detail in our video the other day. However, the one on the right is something I just wanted to show you again. If you want to provide qualitative analysis of movements, you need to understand the development of motor patterns or movement patterns. So what are the basics? When we look at a dive, does a dive involve stability? Is it locomotor? Is it manipulative? Well, I don't think they're actually manipulating any object. There's no ball, there's no bat, there's nothing that they're trying to bounce, etc. So I don't think manipulative skills is there. But I think stability is going to be a part of what happens on that block. But then there is a movement from the block into the water, so the locomotor. And so what part of that basic movement do we take from when that child was young and they were growing up? Were they not very well balanced? Did they miss out on that basic skill? What are these things that we need to start looking at? We think about how they learn, not only how they develop. Pedagogy means how we teach. So what sort of teaching and coaching practices we could give to help develop that young person. And then also biomechanics, the study of human movement. What sort of movement do we know should have happened with their legs, their arms, their body, compared to what actually did happen? That gives us a good qualitative movement analysis. So, the key concept part up the top comes straight from the framework from VCAA study design. What we're looking at here is the definition. What is qualitative analysis of movement? Well, it is the systematic observation of the quality of human movement for the purpose of providing the most appropriate intervention or improved performance. Systematic observation. That means I'm observing in a systematic fashion. That means I see like a flow chart in my head where I've got something at the start, something I look at next, something that I look at next. So for that dive, I'm looking at foot position. And then I'm looking at whether they got their body into a set stance. And then I'm looking at their extension off the block. And then I'm looking at their travel time through the air. And then I'm looking at the angle in which they entered the ground. I'm systematically looking for each of the cover points for somebody who understands diving to know as I go through my own checklist. But what skills do you guys know? As students who have chosen PE and have a passion for sport, exercise, and physical activity, what is your sport? What is your focus? I know we have dancers in our class. We have soccer players or football players in our class. We have players who excel at cricket at AFL. So I'm asking you, what sport do you know about that you could systematically observe someone completing a skill so you yourself could provide qualitative analysis of their movement? So feedback is still absolutely critical here. It helps in the development of skills, but it also helps with preventing injuries and rehabilitating someone. So if we see that somebody is performing a skill wrong, part of the issue could be that they continue to perform this skill wrong. They're going to hurt themselves. So if you've got a baseballer who's swinging the baseball bat at the wrong pace, speed, or using the wrong muscles, and they continue to do that, they could really tear their rotator cuff. A lot of that power should be coming from chest, it should be coming from abdominals, it should be coming from leg muscles and turning the torso and the body. And yet this person is swinging with all shoulder movements. They're going to hurt their shoulder as they continue to progress to the next level. It might be okay for beginners and basics, but we want to teach them the right skills and the basics from early on and continue to develop. So, injury prevention rehabilitation. Coaches need to know the knowledge and the skills and have the right equipment necessary. Because if you don't have the right equipment, it's going to be really hard to make the recommendations on what changes to be made. Qualitative analysis can look at movements. Qualitative analysis is also widely recognized as sport science, and within the community of sport and sports science, qualitative analysis is really well designed and developed to try and continue to improve the skills, prevent injuries, and rehabilitate athletes. It often involves sports scientists, coaches, medical staff, etc. And coaches really need a deep level of understanding of what the skill is meant to look like. Now, just before we go into this four-stage approach, please understand that this is quite often examined by the VCAA. So having qualitative analysis background information that we've spoken about already is really important. It can come up in multiple choice questions. But this next part that I'm about to go through, this four-stage process, this is examined most years by the VCAA. So please know that what I'm about to go through is pretty important for you, and we're going to revisit it back in class a lot of times between now and when we finish learning and teaching this area. So, when we perform qualitative movement analysis, when we want to give someone descriptive feedback about their movement, we need to face a four-staged approach. We need to go through four stages: preparation, observation, evaluation, error correction. This is cyclical, like a cycle, which means it goes backwards and forwards the entire time. So please understand as well that we can go preparation, observation, evaluation, error correction, and back to some more preparation, or skip from error correction back to observation and continue with this mini cycle down below here. What do we mean by each stage? Now, preparation. Before you're going to analyze anyone's movements in a qualitative way, you need to know what you are going to gather, what you are going to be looking for. The analyst needs to know what are the features of that skill. So I can go through that systematic observation. I need to know what I'm looking for. What information do I have about the performer? So what's really important here is to note that maybe that baseball player I was talking about earlier has actually got a repaired shoulder, and they actually have restricted movement in their shoulder, which is leading to them having to change their style from what we usually see to the style that you currently see. And they've been taught to do this for specific reasons. So by knowing your individual and doing that in your preparation phase of this four-staged approach, you're going to be able to give good qualitative analysis. If you don't know the individual and you go in there with a generic approach, you're going to provide information to that athlete which is not going to be injury prevention at all. It's actually going to potentially injure an athlete that you don't know about, a weak shoulder or a repaired or damaged, whatever it might be. So we continue on with this. You need to know what you're going to be observing, how you're going to be observing it, where you're going to be observing it. And you also need to know how to provide instruction to an athlete after you've seen what you're going to see. Then we move on to the observation. Now, this one seems pretty straightforward, that you would just simply watch the athlete and provide them with feedback afterwards. However, we need to understand that in sport, quite often, the skill that we're looking at is performed very quickly. So sometimes you can watch a performer just with the naked eye and then see what went right or what went wrong and tell them information straight away. However, digitally recording or video filming this information, this skill being performed, can be absolutely critical in ensuring that you're giving the best feedback and the right feedback to any athlete. You need to also make sure that the observation has been planned and that the athlete knows that they're going to be observed, so that they know what sort of feedback you're potentially going to be giving them or what they need to focus on in their movement. You're trying at this point to gather and organize information. This is the stage where a lot of people will jump straight to conclusions without forming the right conclusion and potentially give wrong feedback. So it is just the observation stage, and sometimes you can actually measure things during your observation in this stage. So you might be actually putting out measuring markers, tape measures, etc., and maybe even speed guns, so you can see how quickly things are happening at the same time, or how far they travel as just watching them. Now we get into the absolute crux and the main part of this four stage, which is we need to evaluate what we saw in our observation. So we need to actually look at what did we prepare for, what did we observe. And during this stage, we identify the errors and the positive aspects of technique. We go through that sequential method, that systemic one that we were talking about before, And we actually make sure here that we're looking at the mechanics of the movement, whether the order of the movement is correct, whether the angle of movements are correct. We are evaluating what we're looking at here. We would look at pictures of body positions throughout each phase of the movement. We would look at potentially what the desirable position of each phase would be, so what the discrepancy is between start, middle, and end of that movement. Sometimes what we do is we look at what sort of range of motion we're getting around the joint, what sort of force is being developed. So if we're looking sequential, we're looking at part A, part B, then part C. If we're looking mechanical, we're looking at all various parts and trying to find the missing link in those parts. When you do the evaluation, just have a look at a small number of critical features. If you're going back to an athlete and giving them 10 different dot points to try and fix up on a movement that they perform poorly, they're not going to be able to fix up 10 different aspects straight away. You just want to focus on the most critical and the biggest things that are going wrong at starters. But also, don't forget in your evaluation to look at things that went right as well. Look at the strengths, okay? Look at range of motions as something that was a positive, for example. Try and find something for that athlete that is a positive. Now, finally, we go to that athlete and we provide the correction of that error. We actually explain to them what the strengths and weaknesses are. We talk to them about their technique and their performance. We provide verbal feedback, but we can also replay the video for the athletes so they can use their own auditory and visual cues and feedback when they watch it. We talk to them about their proprioception and how it felt for them and their touch feedback. So whatever method we choose, it's really important to sit down and explain to the athlete what you saw and how that error can be corrected. How can it be fixed? What should the athlete be doing on their next attempt to fix up the errors that we just saw? It's really important on error correction as well to understand that during your preparation, observation, and then your evaluation, you didn't just watch the athlete perform the skill once. We need to know that this is a common error the athlete is making. We all make errors once, and it could be a really poorly performed skill on that one occasion. So make sure you've watched 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 attempts. So what you can see here is a range of different things that I've just been through. You could provide a mechanical aid like a brace to help a performer maintain body position. You could physically move the performer's arm, etc. So each of these aspects can be done. You can actually show them the footage like I explained. You can ask an athlete to over-exaggerate something so they feel what it would look like to lean forward more by having them practically lean forward to the ground. You can actually change their practice so that they're actually focusing on the one thing you want them to provide improvements on. So by doing that, we would be going back to a constraints-based approach to coaching. I'm going to actually leave it there. You'll notice that there's some tasks to complete and some quotes that are taken that Mr. Smith has put into those PowerPoints. Don't stress about those right now. Hopefully that 4-stage approach and more detail about what qualitative analysis is really helping you guys form an understanding of how to improve skills for athletes. Obviously, this is starting to step into sports science or biomechanics, and we're going to talk about in the upcoming chapters biomechanics. When we do that, we actually break down what are the things we can look for in video footage. What does it mean to have the right force, impulse, inertia? Are we taking into consideration gravity when we look at projectile motion? All of these aspects are things we're going to continue to move on into in the next couple of weeks prior to SAC number 1. But we need to have this basis of what it means to improve performance of athletes early on. I just want to show you very quickly another quick PowerPoint. This will be uploaded here into our resources on Compass. This is all about direct-based coaching and constraints-based coaching. I feel like all of this was discussed in our lesson the other day, and I've got a couple of questions to answer for students around this already. But looking at what individual, environmental, and task constraints are and how we can make modifications to them, please note that, as I said, these are the most closely related to performance when we change task constraints. And for each learning style, cognitive, associative, and autonomous, there are different ways that we can best meet the needs of an athlete or specific group, similar to what I've mentioned a few times already, in that there is no one size fits all approach. I guess the direct coaching is trying to make a one size fits all approach, and we know that that is not true and effective. There's a hot shots tennis activity here that I think might be really beneficial for those students who have the additional time or want to look at it for homework. So by opening this constraints PowerPoint and going down to slide number 15, you'll notice that in here it's going to refer you to a website. You're going to be able to watch some of these mini games that have been created for hot shots tennis to try and get young kids more involved in tennis. I want you to look closely. Look at the equipment, look at the line markings, look at the movement patterns. What are the task-based constraints that they have placed into hot shots tennis? And then what's the environment like? And then what do we know about the individuals? Are they large, small, big muscle groups, small muscle groups? What sort of things is hot shots tennis taking into consideration for constraints-based coaching? The only other reason I wanted to draw your attention to this PowerPoint is at the start, Mr. Smith showed his class, and I've already showed you guys this, where our SAC lies for physical education, okay? So we're looking at that SAC timetable, we're looking at where it's currently sitting at, and we're also flipping over here, and there are some multiple choice questions which have answers attached, short answer questions which have answers attached, that relate to feedback and coaching that we've looked at already. There's one last thing that I wanted to draw your attention to, if I could, and it's on Compass again, and it's a Microsoft Word document that actually goes through a practice question that is involved in constraints-based and also feedback, and looking at movement patterns for somebody who completes long jump. Now, I don't believe that we've got the full definition in our minds of all the biomechanics to probably give the best possible answer to this question at the moment. However, I think that we're well on our way. And I know that we did this for a question around basketball free throw shooting in our previous topic. So I think it is worth opening up that Word document, reading through the question, maybe not looking so much about page 2, which is the suggested response so far, but just starting to pick apart in your mind, what would you start to put down as your answer for those questions so far in your learnings? I know this has been a long video. Hopefully it's really helping you. You know that you've got Ed Rollo work to do. If your Ed Rollo is up to date, you know that you've got your peak performance to do. If that's also up to date, then what you've got to do is the stuff from this video. Look at the hot shots tennis, pick apart that diving video, and also finally have a look at what I just showed you in that long jump example so that you can start really working chapter 2's knowledge into what does it look like in questions and answers. Good luck today, and I'll see you tomorrow.